Welcome to this short video on PROMIS Benchmarking. PROMIS provides clinicians with an efficient multi-domain set of outcome measures, administered using a computer adaptive test, and yielding a t-score, a score that has a mean of 50 and a standard deviation of 10. One of the domains within the outcome measures in PROMIS is called physical function, and it's an outcome measure that typically takes 4 to 12 items to yield a physical function t-score. However, a patient's 4 to 12 responses will likely not provide the clinician with the type of information they need to understand the patient's capabilities. Therefore, there's work needed on PROMIS for interpretation and clinical usefulness. For the current project, we looked at the PROMIS Physical Function version 2.0. We took and used the World Health Organization's ICF coding for activity and participation level activities, and we categorized the entire item bank of 165 items in the physical function measure. And then using item calibration data, we created a physical function snapshot, a one-page visual tool that would provide the clinician with information about a patient's likely capabilities in 9 different categories. And here it is. Using this calibration data to create cut scores for how difficult an activity is called benchmarking. So let's take a look at this physical function snapshot. And feel free to use pause here to get a bit more acquainted as we go. So along the top, you see there are 9 categories. Categories pulled directly from the WHO ICF activity and participation coding. We have self-care, hand and arm use, transferring, walking, lifting and carrying, housework, climbing stairs, fitness, and running. And you'll notice they're set up in progressive order of difficulty, lowest to highest in general. Now down at the bottom, we have 36 items, 4 items from each category. And these are the items from the 165 items on the PROMIS item bank. So under self-care, we have brush teeth, wash and dry your body, dress including shoelaces and buttons, and taking a tub bath. And you'll see within that category, the colors indicate that each of those is progressively more difficult. Jump forward to walking, the 4th column, and you'll see a question: does your health limit your ability to walk in your house? Or does your health limit you in taking a short walk? Are you able to walk briskly for 20 minutes without rest? And then can you hike 2 miles, including uneven ground and hills? And again, within that category, the items are progressive. Jump all the way up to fitness or running, and you see that these are high-level activities for the most part. Now the color coding is based off respondent answers for the data that was collected on PROMIS for this physical function outcome measure. And you can see the colors indicate from red, unable to do, all the way up to blue, meaning no difficulty or no limitation. And for any given bar here on the left, you can see that each bar reflects the calibration data from the PROMIS for that item, reflecting its difficulty. So that's the general lay of the land, and we'll dive in deeper to understand how this works and how it might be valuable for clinicians. Let's look a bit more at the PROMIS physical function computer adaptive test setup and how the 165 item bank was initially approached. So in the computer adaptive test, the first question is always the same, asking about 2 hours of physical labor. And based off the response, the subsequent question is given in order to hone in on the patient's t-score. Here in this example, the patient's final t-score for physical function was a 40, and that's 1 standard deviation or 10 points below the mean t-score of 50. So initially, all 165 items in the physical function item bank were looked at in reference to the WHO ICF definitions for activity and participation codes, and this led to categorization. Now, the 9 categories in the physical function snapshot that was created were drawn from 4 chapters of the WHO ICF activity and participation codes. The first one was self-care, which actually combined 4 subsections, including washing oneself, caring for body parts, toileting, and dressing. The next was hand and arm use. The next was changing position and transferring, combining those two subsections. Following that is walking. Next, lifting and carrying objects. Housework combines two subsections, including doing housework and caring for household objects, which includes things in the yard. Climbing, and in this case, all our items involve climbing stairs. Fitness, where all of our items were about maintaining physical fitness. And last, running. And that's where we got our final 9 categories for this snapshot. So what's behind the beautiful colors in the physical function snapshot chart? Well, PROMIS item calibration data is based on data from the general US population, including people with chronic conditions. Here we can take an example, the item, are you able to run a short distance, such as to catch a bus? And to the right, we see that the descriptions of difficulty are linked to a certain t-score for that item. Underlying those t-scores is a set of curves specific to the item. And we see 5 different colored curves linked to 5 different levels of difficulty. Orienting to the graph, we see on the x-axis the trait of physical function such that high physical function is to the right and low physical function to the left. And then on the y-axis, we see probabilities from 0 to 1. So someone of very low physical function is highly likely to respond unable to do, as we see from the blue curve, a 0.8 probability. However, there's also a 0.2 probability that a person with very low physical function would say with much difficulty, and we can see that reflected in the red curve. Now, as you progress from the left to the right, you see points in which the curves intersect. Those 4 points are the point when each successive curve becomes higher in probability than its previous curve. So the red dash, you see now that with much difficulty becomes more probable than unable to do, the blue graph, at that point. Same with the green dash that has marked the intersection between with some difficulty and with much difficulty, all the way to the response of without any difficulty, and that we see around +2 on the trait of physical function, the probability of a person responding that they could run to a bus without any difficulty becomes higher than any of the other responses. And if you refer back to the t-scores in that spreadsheet, we see that each of these intersections corresponds with the t-score listed in the spreadsheet. And all 165 items in the item bank for physical function have the same statistics underneath them. It's their calibration, describing that item's relative difficulty and linking it to t-scores. If we jump back over to that item, running short distance to catch a bus, we see we're in the run category on the snapshot. There's the item down below, and we follow up the bar through the colors. We find that those cut scores land right at the color change in the snapshot. And if we look over to the left, we see that those 4 points line up right with the t-scores described in the spreadsheet for this item. Now let's say a new patient arrives at your clinic, and while in the waiting room, they complete the physical function computer adaptive test. You come out to introduce yourself to the patient, and you already know that this patient's t-score is a 36. Now that number in and of itself doesn't tell you much about the patient's capabilities. However, using the snapshot, we could draw a line directly across the snapshot and start to get a picture of that patient's likelihood of responding a given way to all 36 items. Starting on the left in the self-care category, we'd see that they have no difficulty with brushing their teeth or washing or drying their body, and little difficulty with dressing or taking a tub bath. Now these are probabilities, and the patient hasn't answered these specific items necessarily. But the data collected from a very large sample of the population suggests a high likelihood that this patient, who's in front of you, would respond in this manner to these 4 self-care items. What's more, within the self-care category, the items reflect the range of scores, as far as difficulty, of all the items that would be considered self-care in the physical function measure. Move to the right, and we see in hand-arm use, again, no or little difficulty with those items. However, when we get to transferring, we see that a patient with a t-score of 36 might describe some difficulty with standing up from lying on the floor, and would likely even describe much difficulty with squatting and then getting back up. And since each category is progressively more difficult and reflects a higher and higher level of physical function, we could get all the way over to climbing stairs, fitness, and running. And now we see that, by and large, the patient is going to have much difficulty and or be unable to do most of those tasks. Under climbing stairs, we see that perhaps climbing 5 steps can be done with little difficulty, and walking up down stairs at a normal pace, the patient is likely to describe some difficulty with that. But overall, using the snapshot, we now have a pretty broad picture of this patient's likely capabilities, which could be useful going forward with our examination, our evaluation, and development of our plan of care. Now, what if a patient walks in with a 53? Again, we draw the line straight across, and now we see that that patient, who's slightly above the mean for the general population, only starts to have real difficulty in high-level stair climbing, fitness, and running activities. So feel free to pause and explore further if you like. You can check out the items below in a little more detail. So the physical function snapshot is based directly off the PROMIS computer adaptive test. And that test is really efficient at deriving a t-score, which is great for outcomes data collection. The physical function snapshot then is meant to help the clinician interpret that t-score's meaning for the patient who's right in front of them. Given a patient's t-score, what are the potential uses? Understanding the patient's current level of function, goal setting, helping to determine the plan of care, recommending home or community-based interventions, and discharge planning. The goal again is to maximize the clinical usefulness of the PROMIS physical function outcome measure. And that concludes this discussion on PROMIS benchmarking.